Hey everybody. So today we're going to learn how to slow down in the hip without dying. A little while ago I polled the YouTube channel and I asked everyone for what are the things that are still causing you the most grief. And far and away the most popular answer was landings, or more specifically that transition from forward flight to a hover, without entering VRS and smashing into the ground. So, transition to hover is one of those deceptively difficult helicopter skills. The actual list of steps is fairly short. It's just aft cyclic, reduced collective, and left anti-torque pedal to start slowing down. And then once you lose effective translational lift, you start bringing that collective back in, compensate for torque with right anti-torque pedal, and then once you stop, you bring the nose back down with a little forward cyclic. And at least as far as just listing the steps are concerned, that's pretty much all there is to it. But what makes it difficult is all the other factors that go into determining whether or not your attempt at slowing down is a successful one or a fireball waiting to happen. So some of the factors that may help determine whether or not your transition to hover is successful include your current weight, so things like fuel, passengers, cargo, ammunition, and so on. The conditions in the area, temperature, wind speed, altitude, ground conditions, all of that. Certain systems that you have on, so anti-icing and particle separators, for example, both draw significant engine power to operate, and they could be the difference, depending on other factors, between your ability to hover out of ground effect and not. So knowing all of this stuff ahead of time is pretty important just to determine whether or not your maneuver is even possible. And if you don't know that ahead of time, you could very well find yourself in a Vortex Ring State recovery scenario, and that's just not fun for anyone. On top of that, you also have certain parameters like what's your approach speed? How fast are you actually trying to come in? How much room do you have to stop? What obstructions are in the way? So there are all kinds of things to consider, and that's kind of what I mean by this is deceptively difficult. If you don't consider all of those things, or you make some assumptions that are incorrect, it can very easily go from a routine slow down and stop into Now, there's also an element of pilot skill and airframe familiarity here. Now, while not strictly required to perform a transition to hover, they will allow you to be a little more bold, a little more precise, a little more safe, and perform the maneuver with tighter tolerances, for example, heavier weights or stronger winds, or less room to maneuver in confined areas, and so on. A lot of the stuff, it can be taught, but it just takes seat time and practice to really get the hang of. And so at least initially, you're probably going to want to give yourself a little more room, slow down, start with lighter loads, maybe take less fuel or fewer weapons, something along those lines, until you kind of get a feel for what the helicopter's telling you and how to respond to it, as well as a better understanding of its limitations, for example, how quickly you can safely pull collective, and how much distance you really need to slow down. So, today we're going to talk about some concepts. We're going to talk about some of those flight parameters and other factors that I mentioned. We're going to talk about the flight instruments you might care to pay attention to throughout the maneuver. And we're going to do a whole bunch of demos, both at full speed and in slow motion. Now, I should mention that a lot of this will translate over to the hind pretty readily. However, airframe-specific things like the feedback you get, the shudder, the buffeting, and the shaking, and so on, those are different. The hind doesn't really do that. So there are certain things that I'll be telling you to watch for in the hip that don't happen in the hind. And so if you're trying to take what you learn in this video and just port it over to the Hind 1-for-1, some of it isn't going to be there. Some of it will be a little bit different. You're also going to have differences in terms of visibility, in terms of available power, and certain flight parameters and behaviors. So just keep in mind that while there are a lot of similarities between the two, and while the general idea still remains the same, anything airframe specific probably won't translate over beyond the very basic direction of rotation. So one of the most important factors, and probably the most common reason pilots find themselves in trouble, is that they're just simply too heavy. And it's not entirely their fault. The mission editor kind of biases you towards being too heavy. And if you don't know that there are things you can do or that you should do, you're going to find yourself in that situation pretty easily. So let's have a look at a default helicopter. This is just dropped into the mission editor as is. And we'll have a look at what's on it and what's not and what we could maybe do about it. So first you've got your external hardpoints. It's your pylons where you can put weapons. They have a little bit of weight, but it doesn't really make too big of a difference. But if you're doing a civil flight, you could probably take them off. But one that does matter a whole lot is your internal fuel, and thankfully that's something you can modify in-game. So at 100% fuel, which is what you spawn with by default, you're looking at 1929 kilograms of fuel. That's about 4,200 pounds. Now I know if you're used to flying fixed wing, you're pretty much used to take as much gas as you possibly can because you will go through it and it won't adversely affect you that much. In helicopter, 100% fuel is enough to fly for like 3 or 4 hours. I can't think of a mission where I need that much fuel where I won't have an opportunity to stop and get more along the way. I, by default, will typically take this and defuel my helicopter to anywhere from 40 to 60%, depending on how long I'm planning on being in the air and how much weight I'm planning on carrying. And just by doing that, just by dropping yourself to say half a tank of fuel, you're saving like 1,000 kilograms or 2,200 pounds. 21, I guess, in this case. 2,100 pounds of fuel. That's a lot. That is a lot of weight. Now you've also got a couple of other options. If you go to this additional properties tab here, you've got exhaust IR suppressors, and you've got additional armor. If we go back to payload tab, now you can see that the exhaust IR suppressors are missing from right here. And you can see a shadow back there and up front where the armor used to be. Now the armor just has weight, so if you're not going to be in combat, it's unnecessary. And the IR suppressors, in addition to having weight, also reduce your maximum takeoff weight because they drain some of your engine power in order to suppress that IR signature. So this 13,000 kilograms number here, your maximum rated takeoff weight, is dropped by about 200, making you that much closer to it already. And then similarly, because the default hot start starts you with the dust protection system on, that also drains engine power and reduces it by a further 200. So this number is a little bit deceptive in a way, and you're actually trying to stay closer to 12,000, not 13,000. So just to show you how even more misleading that 13,000 kilograms number is, here's a couple of charts from the manual that you can use to calculate the maximum weight in which you could hover either out of ground effect, above 23 meters, which is on the left, or in ground effect, below 23 meters on the right. The scale on the left represents your current altitude in meters, while the scale along the bottom represents your current weight in kilograms. Each different line matches up with a different temperature in degrees Celsius. So start by taking the line that best matches the current temperature outside. Follow that line until it intersects either your current or your desired altitude, and that will tell you how heavy you can be for an out-of-ground effect on the left or an in-ground effect on the right hover. A couple of examples. It's currently about plus 37 degrees Celsius in Dubai, so we'll pick the plus 40 line. Dubai is basically at sea level, so we follow that line all the way down until we reach an altitude of basically 0, and then we have a look at our maximum out-of-ground effect hover weight, which is a little over 13,000 kilograms, 13,200 or 300 there. So flying around Dubai, even on a hot day, it's not going to be a problem. But now let's say you were to go across the map to Kerman, over in Iran. That has an elevation of about 1,750 meters. So follow that blue line back till you get to about 1,700 meters. And now we're talking about a maximum takeoff weight of a little over 10,000 kilograms. We're losing 3,000 kilograms just by going to a different city in the same conditions. Now remember that the default spawn for the hip is about 10,800 kilograms, and that's before you start putting weapons on it. So it's very possible that just depending on your location and the weather, you may not be able to hover. Now, one more example. Say you wanted to fly to the top of Mount Elbrus on the Caucasus map. That's an altitude of about 5,600 meters, and the weather's probably going to be pretty cold, so let's pick negative 30 degrees Celsius. That's that green line there. If you follow that green line all the way to 5,600 meters, your maximum takeoff weight is something like 8,500 kilograms. For reference, an empty hip only weighs about 7,800. Even with everything stripped out of the helicopter, there's a pretty good chance you're not hovering out of ground effect at the top of Mount Elbrus with anything more than a token amount of fuel. Now, even that is misleading, because at negative 30 degrees Celsius, you're probably going to have anti-icing on. And as you can see at the bottom of the first image there, with anti-icing on, reduced the maximum takeoff weight indicated by 1,000 kilograms. So now that 8,500 is 7,500, which is below the empty weight of the hip. You could not physically hover on the top of Mount Elbrus in the Mi-8. It just does not have the power. It weighs too much. Now, if you look over at the second image for in-ground effect, and again, you follow that negative 30 degrees Celsius line back to about 5,600 meters altitude, you've got an extra 1,000 kilograms there. You've got up to about 9,600 kilograms, which immediately goes away when you turn on anti-icing and you're back to that 8,500 number again. So in theory, you should be able to hover close to the ground, and this chart is for 3-meter hover. So you could hover 3 meters off the ground barely with like 30% fuel. So it makes a huge difference, and it's something that you should probably try to consider, if at all possible, when planning your flight. Now let's see how easy it is, if I put these things back on, to find yourself in a situation where you might be overweight, because by default, without doing a single thing, you're already sitting at 83% of maximum rated takeoff, almost 11,000 kilograms. So if we throw a couple of gun pods on, we go from 83 to 87%. Throw 2 more gun pods on, we go to 94%. Go Hoggett style with a bunch of rockets and gunners, and we're at 106% maximum rated takeoff. Now, the really scary thing about this is the hip has a lot of engine power, and it's probably going to let you take off like this. Remember that 13,000 is your maximum rated takeoff, not your maximum possible takeoff. So you'll probably get yourself into the air, but if you don't fly around long enough to drain some of that fuel and you don't end up shooting all those rockets, you're going to come back at 105% maximum takeoff weight, and you're going to have one hell of a time trying to slow yourself down without killing your generators and entering Vortex Ring State and falling out of the sky. And that, I think, is probably the most common way that people end up getting into trouble. They have too much gas, they have heavy weapons, they haven't drained enough fuel, and they try to arrest their descent too quickly, or they try to slow down too quickly, and they just can't for the weight they have. There's just not enough engine power left available. So what could we do about that? Well, just by taking our fuel down to 50%, we go from 106% maximum rated takeoff to 98%. It makes that much of a difference just to drain half a fuel tank. So I can't emphasize this enough. Check your fuel, drain half your tank right off the bat. Unless you know you're going to be in the air longer with no chance to refuel, don't go any higher than 50 or 60% fuel. Now for today's demos, I want to show you the practical impacts of that. So we're going to do one loadout at the default settings. So just like this, with 100% fuel, the hardpoint's mounted but empty, IR suppressors and armor on, and we'll be at 83% maximum rated takeoff. We're also going to do that same 106% where we've got the default plus a full complement of weapons. And then we're going to do more of a civil loadout where you're down at I think it's 60% I used, maybe even less. No IR suppressors, no additional armor. And we're sitting here at a much, much lower 70%. And if we go down to, say, 40%, we're at 67% maximum rated takeoff. So we'll be doing some demos in all of those different configurations to show you just how much more tolerance you have, how much room for error there is when you're not completely overloaded, and just the importance of keeping that weight down as much as you can. Alright, so we need to talk about a couple of concepts first. Now, we've talked about these in previous videos, but we do need to go over them again because they are critical for this one. Those are effective translational lift, or ETL, and transverse flow. So what is ETL? Well, ETL is an efficiency gain that the main rotor disc gets at higher airspeeds. It allows us to maintain the same altitude with less power, which is a good thing. But why does it work that way? Well, simply put, the main rotor blades are designed to be most efficient when air enters from a certain direction, which is horizontally. So if we were flying forward, we would be most efficient when air is entering in from front of us, from the right side of our screen here. But in a hover, like we are now, that's not what's happening, is it? All of the air is being pulled in from above the rotor disc, and all the air passing through the disc is doing so in a vertical direction. The blades aren't designed to be efficient in that configuration, not as efficient, and so they have to work harder to compensate, which is why we require so much more collective just to hover at this altitude than we would once we get up to cruising speed. Now, I shouldn't say that necessarily all of the air is entering vertically, because it might be a windy day. And wind, as you know, is indistinguishable from airspeed. So if it were sufficiently windy, we could be getting some, or even all, of the air entering the rotor disc from a horizontal direction. Again, if it's sufficiently windy. On a typical day, it's probably negligible, but my point is to say that you could have effective translational lift even while in a hover with 0 ground speed if the wind is strong enough, because it would bring in all of the air from a horizontal direction, and we would get that exact same gain as if we were to pick up speed and just start flying. So, as we start to pick up speed, we'll start getting a little more air coming in from a horizontal direction. Right now, in the hover, all of our air is coming in vertically, which is inefficient. If we start to pick up speed, we'll get a little bit coming in horizontally, which is efficient. As we pick up more speed, more and more and more speed, we'll get more and more and more of that horizontal inflow with efficient lift, and less and less and less of the vertical inflow with inefficient lift. As we continue to pick up speed, it will change from being majority inefficient and minority efficient to the opposite. It will start to change to eventually be a majority of efficient lift coming in horizontally and a minority of inefficient lift coming in vertically. Eventually we get to the point where basically all of the air entering the disc is doing so in an efficient horizontal way, and at that point we say we have achieved effective translational lift. Now that happens roughly around 30 kilometers per hour, but it depends on your direction, on the wind, on other conditions. So there is no exact hard limit. It just happens at a certain, it'll happen when it happens, and that'll usually be around 30 kph, give or take. That period in between, that transitionary period where we're going from having a minority of efficient lift to a majority of efficient lift, is known as transverse flow. And it's basically a period where we have a mix of efficient and inefficient lift at the same time, and it will generate buffeting and shaking and rattling, and basically feels like turbulence. It feels like the helicopter is going to shake itself apart, at least in this one. And that's because of transverse flow. That's that state in between our inefficient lift and our efficient lift where we have a mix of both. And it causes that sort of dissymmetry, that sort of shaking and buffeting and rattling. Now, that is normal. That is a good thing. It is not the helicopter shaking itself apart. It is expected. It's pretty prevalent in the hip. I don't know how strong it is in the real thing, if it's quite as obvious in that or not, or if it's been tuned a little bit because we don't actually get the physical feedback in the virtual game. But that's all that is, and it's something that you don't need to worry about, that you're not doing anything wrong, you don't need to rush through. There's absolutely no reason to be concerned about it. It's just a natural part of that transition from inefficient to efficient lift. So let's talk about some of the instruments that you may want to pay attention to during a transition to hover maneuver. Now, it's worth noting that you're probably not going to want to stare at these unless you're in IFR conditions and there's no visibility outside, or you're in a location like over the ocean or over the desert or at very high altitude where it's very hard to use visual references. Then you might be paying more attention to your instruments. But in general, you'll want to be looking outside the cockpit and glancing in at these just to make sure everything is still within parameters and is kind of where you expect it to be. Starting over here on the right is your vertical velocity indicator. This reads your descent or climb rate in meters per second. And for a level transition to hover, you want to keep this at about 0. For a landing, that's a little different, but that's kind of not the purpose of this video. We're mostly talking about a level transition to hover here. So the idea is to keep this around 0 so that we're not moving up or down. There is some wiggle room. Plus or minus 2 meters per second is going to be generally okay. What you're really trying to look for is that you're not getting into risk of Vortex Ring State. So once your speed drops below about 50 kilometers per hour and you start to lose that effective translational lift, if your vertical velocity sinks below minus 4 meters per second here, which is this little mark right there, that's where Vortex Ring State happens. And so you'll be staring at this needle or glancing at this needle looking for that trend. Is it sinking? And if it sinks below 2 meters and reaches about 3, you really need to bring some collective in and arrest that descent rate and make sure you don't sink any lower than that. My goal typically is to try to keep it within 2 meters per second either direction. So that'll keep you out of Vortex Ring State. This is important. You should be glancing at this one fairly frequently, but again, try not to stare at it. Above that is your Doppler hover indicator. Only really useful if you're in, again, one of those places where you're IFR, or you're over the ocean, or you're in the desert, or you're at high altitude, somewhere where you don't have any visual reference whatsoever, or very few of them, to determine your hover. So this one, you'll have a white line that emanates out from the center point, and it will tell you which direction you are moving in, and as well as how fast each one of these is kilometers per hour. So useful, but in VFR conditions when you can see, I would prefer not to use it unless absolutely necessary. Coming left, this is your direction indicator. This will tell you which way you're going. The needle will point which way you're moving, and then you can also set your course indicator. This is nice just to get yourself lined up. So if you know the runway heading or your approach heading or the wind direction or something along those lines, you can get yourself set up that way, and you could glance at it once in a while just to make sure you're still pointing into the wind or down the correct heading. But otherwise, probably not something you'll look at much. Below that's your attitude indicator. And this, I mean, you'll look at this maybe for interest's sake, probably more than anything else. Most of the time during this maneuver, you're going to find your nose is up anywhere from 2.5 degrees, a little hash mark here, up to probably 10 degrees, somewhere in that range. But there's no specific amount. It's just however much nose up pitch you need to slow down in the desired distance. Below that is our slip ball, just to make sure that we're still in trim. I have a video on that as well. You can glance at that as much as you normally would. There's nothing special about it during this maneuver. Below that, the turn and slip indicator. Again, probably not something you need to look at really at all. During this maneuver, you'll probably be moving straight anyway, so you can probably just ignore that one. This is our barometric pressure altimeter. This will give us our altitude, our field altitude, or rather our current altitude in according to air pressure. And then beside it is our radar altimeter, which will give us an actual accurate measurement over the ground where we are right now. You'll probably pay more attention to the radar altimeter as you come in for landings and for transition to hover, for cargo, for buildings, whatever. The barometric pressure one is more of a general idea of field elevation and that sort of idea. Probably not going to have to look at either one too much, other than maybe keep an eye on your radar altimeter if there are obstructions and you want to make sure you're maintaining a certain distance or a certain altitude above them. Airspeed indicator, obviously this one's going to be somewhat important as well. You're going to want to know what speed you're starting at, as well as when you're going to lose effective translational lift. And the helicopter will kind of tell you that, but it's nice to be glancing at this ahead of time to kind of know that you're coming up on that speed where you're going to lose ETL, and it would be time to start bringing in some collective. So you'll probably want to start your maneuver around 150 kph. If you're faster than that, it's a good chance to slow down before you begin. And then once you sink below about 100 kilometers per hour, 80 kilometers per hour, somewhere in here, you'll know that pretty soon you should expect to see the helicopter start to buffet and shake as you lose effective translational lift, and that's your cue to start bringing in more collective. So the main two that I'm glancing at are airspeed and vertical velocity indicator to make sure that I'm slowing down at an even pace, that I know when to start adding in collective, and to know that I'm not climbing or descending, that I'm maintaining my desired altitude. Moving down from that, we get engine temperatures. We can keep an eye on them. Probably in most cases, not something you need to check any more than usual. Unless you're coming in and you're unusually heavy, or it's unusually hot, or you're unusually high up at some high airbase somewhere, then you might want to pay a little closer attention to this, but generally it's going to be okay. You can just kind of keep an eye on things like you normally would. Moving left again, now we have main rotor RPM and engine RPM. We're going to talk more about those in a minute, but just know that your main rotor RPM wants to be at about 95 plus or minus 2% RPM, and you're going to lose your generators at 86% RPM. So you want to kind of just check on these every now and then, make sure your main rotor RPM is good, but you'll learn to do this by sound. And the same will go for your engine RPM. You will learn to just hear changes in the engine and the main rotor RPM and understand when they might be concerning just based on sound alone. So at least initially you may want to check out the gauges, have a look at how things are going, but later you'll transition to largely just listening. And then the last one is your rotor pitch in degrees, which is how much collective you're pulling. You're probably not going to pay attention to that one much at all, but it is kind of interesting to see sometimes, particularly if you're heavy or it's hot or whatever in kind of unusual conditions. So that's pretty much it for that. I wanted to show you two more things before we move on. I'll just unpause my head tracking. If you look straight up from here, you'll see anti-icing system right there. You'll want to make sure that these are off unless your outside air temperature is below 0 degrees Celsius, and you can find that over here. So as I mentioned earlier, the anti-icing system will drain about 1,000 kilograms worth of maximum takeoff weight from your engine power, so only run them if you need them. And a similar idea, your engine dust protection are right here, these two switches. When they're on, these two indicators will light up after a moment. And these also drain some of your engine power, so if they're not necessary, just click these off. Okay, so the next thing to talk about is RPM management. Now I'm referring to both the main rotor RPM and the engine RPM, both of which we can find right down here. Now, unfortunately for us, we don't control either one of those directly. All we really have direct control over is the rotor pitch in degrees, which is our collective. So our collective is mechanically linked to the swash plate, which controls the angle of the rotor blades. So as we bring up our collective, you see that needle increase there, and the angle of our rotor blades is changing basically in real time with that. But that's all we have control over. So how does that then relate to engine RPM and again to rotor RPM? Well, the engine RPM is controlled by something called the governor, and its job is to manage the engine RPM, but its goal is to manage the rotor RPM, which it also doesn't control directly. So we're basically several degrees back of indirect control here over our ultimate goal, which is to keep the main rotor RPM happy. And that's happy at 95 plus or minus 2%. That's where we want this needle to be at all times. Now it can go beyond that range, but we get massive losses in lift once we're outside that range, especially once we go beyond either 90% or 103%. Above 103, we risk permanent rotor damage if we stay there for too long, risk overspeeding the rotor, losing lift, and so on. And below 90, we risk losing lift, and if we go even lower to about 86, 87%, we lose our generators and the majority of our lift. So really, we want to stay 95 plus or minus 2, but if you go from 90 to 103, it's not the end of the world so long as it's temporary. So that's kind of a look at what our range is. Now, the engine RPM is controlled, like I said, by the governor. And what it will do is look at how much collective are we asking for. So say we're asking for 3 degrees or 4 degrees of collective here. It will say how much engine RPM do I need to keep the rotor at 95 plus or minus 2, where it's happiest. And so it will bring that engine RPM up to 90% here. And if I bring it back down, now our blades are basically just slicing through the air. They're not really grabbing much air at all. And governor will go, okay, I don't need that much power. I'm going to spool the engines down to, say, 85%. They are there. Now, if I bring the collective up nice and slow, we're going to go from 1 all the way to 13 degrees. So there's 2 and 3. And just keep an eye on what the engine RPM is doing and what the main rotor RPM is doing. So as I ask for more collective, as I change that blade angle for the main rotor blades, the governor is going, okay, at this given collective amount, how much engine RPM do I need to keep the rotor spinning at 95 plus or minus 2%? And so you can see the engine spooling up 95% there as I pass 12 degrees. And then as I finally arrive at 13 here, we're at 96.5% engine RPM, but we're still sitting at 95% rotor RPM. So our rotor is still generating optimal lift, it's still very happy where it is, and the engine has just spooled up to compensate to try to keep it there. Now as I bring it back down again, Same idea. As we bring collective down, the rotor will stay where it is, or it'll climb very slightly as long as it stays in that happy range. And our engine will spool itself down because it doesn't need to have so much power backing up that rotor anymore. We're not grabbing as much air, we're not putting as much load on it, and we don't need as much engine RPM. So that's all fine and dandy. But what happens if I do that a little bit quicker? So now if I go from 1 to 13 a bit faster, watch as the engines try to keep up with me and can't. And as the main rotor RPM dips as a result because it doesn't have enough engine RPM to keep it at that happy range. So I'm going to bring it up a little faster this time. All the way up to 13. And I dip to just about 89.5, 90% rotor RPM because the engines couldn't spool up as fast as I was bringing my collective up. Remember, the collective is directly linked, so the blade angle changes as fast as I can move that lever, as fast as I can push my physical throttle here. But the engine RPM can only spool so fast. They're not fast. They're actually quite slow. And I think that's where people get themselves into trouble, is they're asking for a whole lot of collective in a hurry, and the engine just can't spool up fast enough to support that rotor RPM, and it falls. Now in my case, I didn't go so fast that we lost our lift. We stayed in that 90 to 103% range where we're still probably okay as long as we don't stay there long. And the engine RPM did come up, and the rotor RPM did recover. So chances are in a situation like that we'd be okay, but it'd be a little bit of a close call. Now watch if I bring the collective down quickly again. The engine RPM will lag behind, and the main rotor RPM, as a result of having this higher engine RPM but lower collective degrees, will spike a little bit. So I'm going to bring this down quickly. Rotor RPM spikes a little bit and comes back down as engine RPM falls or tries to fall. So there's a little look at how that works. Now what happens if I go even faster? So I'm going to go from 1 to 13 degrees really quickly, and watch how much the main rotor RPM dips as the engines try to spool up to keep up with me. So here we go. 13 degrees. Rotor RPM fell all the way to 85%, and then it starts to recover as that engine RPM comes up to 96, 97%. So in that case, we lost our generators because we fell under that 86% number, and we also lost the majority of our lift. So there's a very, very good chance that in that scenario, we just fell into Vortex Ring State. And then only one of two things can happen. Either we have the altitude to recover from VRS, or we don't. Chances are, if we're coming in for a landing, if we're doing this transition to hover, we're probably intending to land. We probably don't have the altitude to recover effectively from VRS. And so I think this is really the main scenario where people find themselves in big trouble. So let's bring this down again. Again, there's that spike in rotor RPM as the engines try to spool down. And there it is. So one more time from 1 to 13 quickly. All the way up. Rotor RPM falls because engines can't spool up fast enough to support it and keep it there. And then eventually it comes back up. So the book says 1 degree of collective per second. That's how quickly you should be moving your collective, 1 degree per second. So try it. Put yourself in active pause, and then just sit here and put a timer up and just see if you can do 1 degree every second. And if you can do that, you should see the rotor RPM will stay pretty consistent because you're giving the engine the time it needs to spool up and support the rotor RPM so it doesn't fall. This also means that you need to slow down your transition from forward flight to hover, or bring in collective soon enough that you can do it at that pace. If you can bring in collective at that pace and not lose altitude, you've got it. So a couple of things to keep in mind as you watch these demos. First of all, despite the fact that I'm able to complete the transition to hover with all 3 different configurations, note that the room for error with each is different. Note the amount of collective that I end up pulling that is required to hover in each different configuration is vastly different. Also consider that we are performing level transitions to hover, which means 0 descent rate. Once at hover power, Vortex Ring State kicks in at 4 meters per second descent rate, and if you're already descending at 2 meters per second to come into land, you've got significantly less room for error. So as you take this from a level transition into a descending transition with intent to land, be aware that the difficulty will increase. Alright, so for our first demo, our airfield is just up here, and when I cross over the threshold, I want to start my transition to hover. Now, we want to be, according to the manual, we don't want to start a transition like this above 180 kph. The recommended range is 120 to 180, and I personally recommend 120 to 150 just to make it that much easier for yourself so you don't need as much distance to stop. As you can see here, we're currently at 230 kph, and I think we're accelerating. So we need to slow down. And the way we do that is also the way we do our transition, which is to pull aft cyclic and reduce our collective, and add some left anti-torque pedal to keep the nose pointed where we want. So we're going to do that. Unpause it here, bring our collective down, keep our nose up so that we don't climb or descend, and that's on the vertical velocity there. We want to descend a little, but not too much. Let's bring the nose up to control our descent rate, and then left pedal to keep our nose pointed where we want to go. Now if I pause it again, I'm only 2.5 degrees up here. It's not a lot. My vertical velocity is basically 0. I'm just bringing the nose up enough to keep that needle around 0. And then my speed is dropping. And this is kind of the hard part, is you want to make sure you're watching how quickly this needle is dropping so that you can correct. Bring the nose down, add some collective, bring the nose down back to about level. Add a little bit of collective to keep your vertical velocity at 0. And then maintain a speed somewhere in that 120 to 150 range when we get there. So continue to descend, or continue to slow rather. And I'm basically looking at my airspeed as glancing at that just to see when I'm in the right range. I'm just holding this 2.5. Now I'm 5 degrees nose up. Now I'm below 150. Descending a little, which is okay because we're a little high. But I'm now at 5 degrees collective, or 5 degrees pitch up, which is just, how much nose up do I need to maintain the attitude I want. And now I'm below 150 kph. So what I'm going to do is add some collective, bring that nose down, and as I add collective, add some right pedal. I want to avoid accelerating past 150, so I'm still keeping the nose up as required. Nose up slows you down, and then I'm reducing collective to manage my altitude. So since I need to drop a little bit more, I'm going to reduce collective. But I'm going to keep my pitch roughly where it was. Use the anti-torque pedals to keep myself pointed towards the runway. As long as you're moving this fast, you can safely descend as quickly as you need to. So I'm just slowly reducing collective a little bit here, descending at 6 meters per second, still about 2.5 degrees pitch up. Now I'm going to straighten my nose out to the left and roll a little bit to the right to move over and line up. And then as I come down, I'm going to add some more collective to stop my descent. Bring in a little bit of right pedal as I bring in more collective. And then I'm going to stop that right roll now that I'm basically lined up. Okay. So now I've got the runway right in front of me. I'm not really climbing or descending much. 1 meter per second is good. I'm pitched up very slightly just to maintain a speed of about 140 kph. So I'm glancing at these things to see if I'm in the right ranges, but this is going to be the hard part. You're going to do this initially. You're going to pay a lot of attention to these gauges. You really want to be looking out here and glancing inside just to make sure whether or not you're in the right range, or whether you still need to slow down, or whether you're way out of whack. So it's glance inside, look back out. Glance inside, look back out. And you want to spend as much time focusing out here as you can to get an idea of what that glide slope really looks like and feels like without staring at your instruments. Okay, so from this point, we are ready. Once we cross the threshold, we're going to start our transition to hover. So I'm going to unpause it. Again, anywhere in that 120 to 150 range is going to make your life a lot easier. Alright, now as we get over the runway here, I'm going to start my maneuver and we'll see how long it takes. So, pause it here. So what we're going to do, again, is aft cyclic, lower our collective, left anti-torque pedal, try to keep the VVI around 0. I'm going to be glancing at that as I go. Otherwise, I'm going to be staring at trees beside me, and then over there is a tower as I get closer, and I'll be looking at that tower to see whether or not I'm slowing down enough. And if we can't slow down fast enough, then there's always trees at the end of the runway approaching us, so we'll see how it goes. Alright, let's do this one in slow-mo. So, Alt and Z, I believe. Yep, slows it down. Unpause. Alright, so we pitch up, we collective down. I pitched up a little quickly there. Bringing in more collective. Slowly, just kind of tapping my throttle, pushing it forward, fingertip only. Glancing at the VVI just to see if I'm still around 0. Looking at the trees outside. Looking at the runway ahead of me. Looking for that taxiway to see how quickly that's approaching. Alright, there's the buffeting and shaking. I'm pausing it here. So that's transverse flow. That's that state where half of the air is coming in horizontally from in front of you, and half the air is coming in vertically from above you, and it makes the rotor produce a similar lift and shake and rattle. And it's fine. It's not going to break your helicopter, but it is your indicator that you're at about, here we are, 65 kilometers per hour, which is right around that threshold where we're going to lose effective translational lift. So if we slow down any more at this point, we know that we need more collective, more anti-torque pedal to keep ourselves in the air. So unpause. And we can ride this now. If we want to, I can bring the nose down and add a little bit of collective. And as long as I stay in this kind of shudder, oh, I'm adding too much because I'm in slow-mo. But if we stay in this, like in the shudder here, we know that we're still around that threshold, and we can extend our transition to hover as far as we need to. So we can ride this shudder all the way to our FARP, our landing pad, our parking spot, or to our taxiway exit or whatever, if we need to, just by bringing that nose down and bringing in a little collective to keep our descent rate managed. So I'm going to bring that nose down more because it's starting to shudder less. So we'll pick up a little more speed. Again, watching our vertical velocity indicator here and there, but basically just staring at that taxiway exit to kind of gauge, am I going to overshoot or undershoot, and what do I want to do about that? So there we've got more shudder again, so I'm going to bring the nose back up a little. And at this point, I think I'm going to start slowing down. So bring the nose up a little more, bring the collective down a little more. Again, glance at the VVI, adjust as necessary. And then as we slow down, we're going to lose that shudder pretty soon here. There it goes as we transition out of transverse flow, lose ETL, and now we're basically under hover conditions as far as power requirements go. So now I'm looking at that yellow line out there in relation to my mirrors. Bringing in collective as needed to keep my VVI at 0. Sometimes it can be hard to judge whether you're descending or not. And that's pretty much it. So now we've come to a hover. So I can trim there. And in reality, you should be trimming basically throughout the maneuver. But I, like a lot of people, do tend to just forget about that and hand fly these maneuvers all the way in. But there we go, we're in a hover. And we can confirm that with our Doppler gauge here. It tells us we're not moving. And that's all there is to it. So let's do that again at full speed. Alright, so we're on approach again. There's our airfield just down there in the distance. Our altitude is better this time. But we are at 250 kilometers per hour, and again, accelerating. So we need to slow down. We need to basically cut that in half, about 120 to 150 kph. Altitude is less important for this maneuver. It's not a precision landing. So we care more about, are we at an altitude where we can follow visual references like treetops or towers and things. So getting around treetop height is probably good. We don't need to really care too much about our altitude beyond that. We do need to get our airspeed down, and we don't really want to climb too much since we're already at a decent altitude here. So again, same maneuver, unpause it, collective down, keep the nose pointed up so that we aren't climbing or descending, and then adjust your nose direction with the left anti-torque pedal. Anti-torque pedal and your collective, you can almost think of them as just being bound together. Whenever you reduce your collective, you add left pedal. Whenever you increase your collective, you add right pedal. Now, as people like Kozoro will also be quick to remind you, and this is true, it isn't that important that you keep the nose pointed straight in a helicopter, especially as you're on approach here. If you come in crooked like this, that's fine. In fact, that's almost a better thing in some cases, because now I have this great visibility down the middle that I didn't have before. Just use your cyclic to keep yourself moving the right direction, and it doesn't really matter which way your nose is pointed. So you can come in crabbing like this the whole way, and that's totally cool. As far as I know, procedure is once you're below a certain altitude to bring that nose out and point it in the direction of flight again. But don't worry too much if your nose is kind of all over the place. It's not that important in the helicopter. More important is that you have that visual reference, that you can see your you can see where you're going, that you're at the right altitude, and that you know where you're, well, that's it, that you have visibility. So don't worry about it. All right, pausing here. Without looking at my instruments at all, just kind of flying towards the runway. I'm at 110 kph, and I'm descending a little bit, which is fine. I want to speed up just a little to put myself in that 120 to 150 range, and I probably want to stop my descent. So what I'm going to do is bring my nose down a little bit to pick up speed, and then that's going to cause me to descend, so I'm going to add some collective, and as I add collective I have to add right anti-torque pedal. So forward, up, right. Alright, unpause, lean the nose down, add some collective, add some right anti-torque, bring that speed up, watch my vertical velocity, and then as we cross over the threshold here, alright, now we're up at 140, which is fine. We're descending only slightly, which is fine, and we're going to start our maneuver. So again, it's going to be aft on the cyclic, down on the collective, left on the anti-torque pedals. And I'm going to be really, really smooth with it. It's just a little bit. So as we do this, we come up just slightly, I reduce collective just slightly, hardly at all, like a degree, maybe, or two. And just kind of bring that nose up, watch my vertical velocity, glance at it here and there, try to keep it, 0, -1, somewhere around there. 1 meter per second down. And just hold this. And the more I need to slow down, the more I can bring that nose up, and the more I have to compensate with collective and pedal. But basically looking at that yellow line out there, there's my transverse flow. So I know I'm going to need a little more power now, or I'm going to start sinking, and a little more right anti-torque pedal with it. But otherwise I'm just holding that attitude, keeping myself over the runway, trying not to sink too much. And so I've overshot a little bit. I didn't slow down as aggressively as I could have if that was my target. But the only way you're going to get that is with practice, with trying to slow down to see how aggressive you need to be. At 150 kph, you can slow down very aggressively. You can slow down very, very quickly in this thing, which is why I recommend get yourself into that speed, into that range of speeds, so that no matter how little time you have to slow down, it should be fine. If you come in hot at 300 kph, which we're going to do later, I'm going to show you how long it does take to slow down, reasonably safely. Alright, so for the second set of demos here, we're using the civil loadout, which is my sort of preferred and the one you'll see me flying the most, my preferred loadout, which is no IR suppressors, no weapon pylons, and no extra armor panels. And if we jump inside the helicopter, we're also going to turn off the dust protection since we're landing at a prepared site here. So F1. So from inside the helicopter, we just look to the right, look over the co-pilot's head, and there's our 2 dust protection lights. Just flip those switches down, and it'll take a few seconds, but those lights will go out, extinguish, to tell you that the system is off. Good. And then also check our anti-icing, make sure that's disabled as well. Otherwise, same idea as last time. We're just going to demonstrate that this does work. And you'll find that in this configuration, it's even easier to stop, and you can be even more aggressive without running into trouble. But for this demo, we're going to follow what the manual says and slow down gradually and gracefully. Alright, so I'm just looking at the runway threshold, and I'm keeping that in relation to where my fan blades are. Just trying to keep it in basically the same place. Glancing at my airspeed now and then, I need to bring my nose down a little and add some collective to bring up that airspeed. Getting a little slow. Just a little. Still want to maintain that descent rate, but I wanted a little more speed than that. So I'm actually going to reduce collective now to come down more. Again, descending quickly is fine as long as you have the airspeed to stay out of that danger zone. Alright, so as we cross the threshold now, I'm descending still. So let's pause it right about here. Alright, so I'm descending a lot. I'm going to want to stop that. But I'm going to add some aft cyclic, probably a little bit of collective. Actually, I might not, because when I add some aft cyclic, it's going to cause me to climb, so that might balance itself out. And I'm looking to maintain this speed of about 138-ish, 140 kilometers per hour. Somewhere in that range will be fine. So we'll put this in slow-mo. Whoops, that's the wrong way. Slow-mo. And pause. Alright, so now we bring the cyclic aft a little bit, bring the nose up. And that's going to cause us to start slowing. It's going to cause us to climb a little bit. So I haven't actually touched my collective yet. And I'm just sort of going to hold this now. I'm going to keep this nose up attitude. I can turn the nose if I want to at this point. As long as I use my cyclic to keep myself going the direction I want, I can basically crab in because I get better visibility here. As long as I keep that nose up attitude, keep slowing down, glance at my VVI, adjust the collective to bring in a little more altitude so I don't descend. It's all nice and gradual. There's transverse flow as we start to buff it and shake. So I know that as that gets more intense, I need to start bringing in some collective so I don't descend. And then it's going to get less intense as I continue to slow and move into basically hover power. Now I'm out of that, and you can see I've basically come to a hover already. So bring in more collective because I'm descending. Try to manage that altitude, and you'll get a feel for that as you go. Alright, so pausing it right here. We're descending a little, which is okay. We're going to want to counter that, but we're also going to go nose up to start slowing. So that's going to cause us to climb, so I may not actually have to do much with the collective initially. We'll see how it balances itself out. Speed is just below 150, so we're good. Glancing at our our main engine RPM, it has come down a little. It's at 78% there. So because I've got, you know, one degree of collective pitch here, the engines are spooling down. So they are going to need some time to come back up, so that's something to be aware of. And you can determine that just by the sound of the engine. You'll get that as you try this over and over. You'll hear the engines spool down, and you won't have to look to see what their RPM is to know that, okay, I need time to let them spool back up again before I have the power to support my rotor RPM. Alright, so let's unpause and we'll do our transition. Alright, so bring the nose up gently, just a little, couple of degrees. Adjust our altitude, keep our glance at our VVI, make sure we're around 0. Look at treetops, if you can use them instead. And you can hear our engine spooling back up. I'm adding more collective. There's our shutter. I know I need more collective now to keep that altitude. And I can bring that nose down a little. Oh, there we go. And like, look how quickly you transition to hover in this configuration. So if you set yourself up, you come in at 150 kph, you can transition to hover very, very quickly. It doesn't take much time at all. It's all in that preparation ahead of time, getting yourself slowed down, getting yourself to the right altitude, so that you're not trying to correct all of that stuff while you're also trying to do your transition to a hover over top of your landing point. Alright, so our last configuration here is Overweight. It's basically a default spawn, so I've got the IR suppressors up there, I've got the weapon pylons, and I've got the extra armor panels. I've also got a full tank of fuel. Now I've also added 6 rocket pods, as you can see hanging from the pylons. I've added the side door gunner, and I've added the rear door gunner. So we are at 106% of maximum takeoff weight, and that's before the reductions from the IR suppressors and the particle separators that we're leaving on. Now I did try this a moment ago with the anti-icing enabled as well, and I could only get 2 meters off the ground. It just doesn't have the power with this kind of weight, so again my recommendation will be turn off the anti-icing. But you'll figure that one out when you can't take off. Alright, so we're entering, or just about to cross the threshold. We're not descending much, just a little, which is okay. We're a little above treetop heights. We're a little high this time. That's alright. We can descend a bit as we transition, and that's okay. We are at 120 kph, so we're on the low end of my target range, which is fine. Our rotor RPM is a little high, and that's okay. Engine RPM is good. We're up at 91% or 92% here, so yeah, 91, I think. Yeah, so that's just fine. That's right where we want to be. So we're going to slow down time, Alt-Z, and then I'm going to unpause it, and we're going to very gently pitch up just a little bit. It won't be much. It's like that kind of movement. It's hardly anything. And then we'll manage our altitude with our collective, manage our nose with our pedals, as we always do. So bring the nose up a little bit, not much, just a bit. And you can see our VVI has climbed already to 0, so I'm going to reduce collective slightly so we don't climb. I want to descend a little bit. We are losing speed. There's our VVI just below 0, which is where I want it for this one. I want to descend slightly. I'm a little high. But no more than 1 meter per second descent. I'm just holding the nose where I need to manage that descent and slowing down. Bringing in a little more collective now. I'm starting to feel a bit of shake from transverse flow, so I know I need to bring in more collective. Again, gently, very slowly. I'm just kind of tapping the throttle forward, or collective, with my fingertips. And I added too much as it is there. Slow motion is hard. Here we go, we're transitioning through transverse flow. We no longer have ETL. I'm bringing in more collective now so I don't fall out of the sky. And there we go. Now I can keep that nose up and finish slowing down just a little bit. And if I look outside, I have reference points of that fence or those bushes or the trees out on this side. And I'm hovering. I'm in an overweight helicopter, 106% max takeoff weight, with dust protection on, full fuel, a whole bunch of full rocket pods, and following that procedure, getting myself prepared ahead of time down to 120 kph at an altitude that I'm happy with, so I don't have to climb or descend during my maneuver. And I can stop well in advance of that taxiway off there. And so typically what you would do is either you could transition fully to a hover, and then you can air taxi your way to where you want to go, which is perfectly acceptable. Or as you start to hit that shutter, you can bring the nose down just a little and basically ride it most of the way, or most of the way anyway, to where your exit is or to your landing pad is. And then you can descend from there, finish your transition once you're over top. But for the purposes of this video, the point is not necessarily to get you onto the ground, but to get you from forward speed to no speed without falling out of the sky and without wrecking the helicopter. So as we cross that threshold, I'm descending kind of rapidly, but as I pull aft cyclic, I'm going to climb some. So I'm going to wait and see how that kind of works itself out, and then I'll adjust my altitude with my collective after that. Speed is again just at 120, just barely in that range that I'm talking about, your target range. And it's exactly the same procedure we've done the last few times in a row. So aft cyclic to start slowing down, very gently, just a little bit. Doesn't take much. You only have to bring the nose up a little. Watch my VDI, just glance at it, and then see where it ends up as I bring the nose up. Adjust for that with my collective. Keep my pedals wherever I need them to be. So unpause, bring up that nose just a little bit. I'm going to start climbing, or at least not descending as much. Now I'll bring in more collective to bring that VDI to 0. And then I just kind of ride this as I slow down, start to buff it and shake, bring in more collective, more right anti-torque pedal, keep my nose kind of where it is, just bringing in more collective, transition through transverse flow, more collective again, so that I don't fall, and I've stopped. I can look at the bushes down there, the trees, the runway, the lines, whatever I need to as my reference point. But even in an overloaded helicopter, as long as you spend that time, get yourself set up, 120 kph, you can stop very, very quickly. So, and again, it just comes down to how smooth are you. So the last couple of demos that I have are ones that I really debated just taking out of the video entirely. But I do think there's some value in leaving them in, at least with this little bit of context. So these aren't really things I want to teach per se, they're not in the book, but they are worth having a look at because they are things that players will do. So we're going to be coming in too fast, and in one case too heavy, and we're going to try to slow down too quickly, and we'll see what happens. It's a good example of how weight can be the deciding factor between success and otherwise, and like I said, I think there's some value in at least talking about it. Just keep in mind that I'm not trying to teach this. If you're looking for what you should be doing, see the previous examples. Alright, so this time we're going to do the exact same maneuver we did before. We're in the civil loadout again, but we're not going to prepare ahead of time and slow ourselves down. We're just going to come in hot at 300 kph, give or take, and go, oh crap, we're here, we need to slow down now, what do we do? And we're just going to follow those same instructions, and I just kind of want to show you how much longer it takes to slow down. So we're coming in here, I'm going to pause it over the threshold again. Just about here, we're going to pause. Alright, having a look at, trim there so it can let go. We are climbing quite a bit, so I'm going to want to reduce that. We are at almost 280 kilometers per hour. And we're going to try to slow down. Instead of being at the usual 120 to 150, we're basically double what we're supposed to be. So it's going to take us a little while to slow down. We're going to do the exact same thing after the cyclic, gently, adjust collective as needed to keep our altitude steady, and pedals as needed to keep our nose pointed. So, unpause, here we go. Collective is going to come down, we're going to bring the nose up. I'm bringing the collective all the way down just about here, yeah, to stop from climbing. I've got the nose up, I'm going to bring the nose up more now. I'm up at 10 degrees of nose up pitch, and I'm slowing, but now I'm at 150. And then I should be, there's 100. Bringing in collective so I don't descend too much. I've got to bring that engine RPM up, I know that. There's my transverse flow. Bring in more collective so I don't descend too much. And I can bring the nose down so I'm not descending quite so rapidly as well. Now I'm 5 degrees here, nose up. So there we go, we finished our transition basically to hover at the other end of the runway. So consider how much more space you need to slow down, more or less following the book, with the wrong starting parameters. In cases like that where we come in really, really hot. So I think this is something that a lot of DCS players, a scenario that we find ourselves in pretty commonly is, I didn't realize the runway was here and I'm going full bore already and I need to slow down. So that procedure will work, but you need a lot more space. So don't be surprised when you overshoot and overfly your target and have to circle around and potentially do that transition again from a better speed. Alright, now some of you are going to say, well, what about quick stops? And you're right. So let's do some quick stops. So quick stops are the same maneuver, but more aggressive and more of an emergency, oh shit, there's something in front of me and I need to stop now Again, we're going to not want to be going too fast, so we're going to be setting up for about 150 kph or 120, somewhere in that range. And it's going to be a very similar maneuver of pitch up, collective down, and anti-torque to adjust your nose, but a little bit more of each. And then there's also going to be a second step to that, which is then rapidly bringing that nose back down once we start to go through transverse flow and everything starts to shutter. Because otherwise we're going to find ourselves going backwards. Alright, so we're at about 150 kph. I'm just going to trim and pause. I'm going to shut off our radar altimeter alert. Alright, so we're 150 kph. We are descending a bit, but that's okay. We're at a good altitude, and as we pitch back, we're going to climb. So this one I'm going to pitch up more, probably 15 degrees, somewhere in that range, maybe even more. I'm going to reduce collective more to manage my altitude, and I'm going to have that problem where my engines are going to spool down. They're going to drop, and I'm going to need to bring them back quickly so that once I transition through transverse flow and lose my effective translational lift, I still have the engine power to back up the rotor RPM. So once that transition happens, you're going to see me push the nose down. So let's actually do this in slow-mo. Alt-Z. Alright, and we take off active pause. Cross that threshold. Now it's going to be a bigger pitch up and a bigger collective drop. And more anti-torque pedal to keep myself pointed. Now I can do more pedal so I can see the runway there, and that's okay. I'm like 20 degrees up here, and I'm stopping really quickly. And then as that happens, collective, bring the nose down. Those engines are coming back up. Alright, look at this. Engine RPM's coming back up. Main rotor RPM dropped. And I lost my generators. Now it just barely dipped below 86, but with the loss of generators, even if I didn't lose a ton of lift, I lost my autopilot channel. And I'm also now getting that extra stress of nagging Natasha, warning me that the generators have failed, even though they came back right away. So that maneuver was too aggressive. I brought collective back too fast, I asked for too much power, too soon, and it took too long for the generators to spool up and provide that power. But I did stop. And then you can finish your transition like you would normally, or pick up speed again. So we do that in full speed. We pick up some speed. We're going a little too fast, but again, it's that idea of aft stick, drop the cyclic, and we slow down rather quickly. Try to keep ourselves pointed. Bring in that collective again. The slower you can bring in that collective, the less likely you are to lose your generators. That time I managed it, but you can see it did dip, and it was probably pretty close. And I picked up more speed than I needed, so again, I'm going to repeat that transition and stop. Quick stops are not a good way to transition if you don't have to. They are an emergency situation, like, oh crap, I need to slow down right now, somebody's pulled out of this taxiway, or there's a building I didn't see, or whatever. But when you do them in the hip, be warned, if you drop your collective enough and the engines spool down, you've got to bring that collective back in gradually. Or you'll do what I did the first time, you'll lose your generators. I still haven't turned my autopilot back on. Let's do that now. You'll lose your autopilot, you'll probably lose a bunch of lift, and you might find yourself in a crater of flames. So, alright, so now I need to demonstrate that quick stops work in the overloaded, overweight helicopter as well. That's not just possible in civil helicopter. So again, it's really important. We want to get our speed down and our altitude down into a more acceptable range ahead of time. So we do that while we have the speed to drop our altitude, and then don't start our maneuver until we're at about 150 kph. So we're a little bit fast there. There we go. Alright, so just over the threshold here. We're basically not descending anymore. Trim just over 150 kph, which is okay. And we're going to do the same maneuver. So it'll be A more aggressive cyclic pull, but still pretty gentle. Probably gentler than you'd expect, but we are going to bring the nose up past 10 degrees. We're going to slow down rapidly. We'll be dropping a lot of collective, but then we're going to have to add in collective sort of preemptively. This is where there isn't really much of a cue other than you're going to recognize how quickly you're slowing down. You can maybe glance at your airspeed indicator. Probably somewhere around 100 kph, you'll want to start bringing that collective back in. Again, do it slowly, 1 degree per second. Otherwise, you're going to overload. You're going to ask for more power than is available because your engine RPM will have spooled down, and it takes time to come back, and it won't be able to support your rotor RPM, which will drop. You'll lose your generators, you'll lose your altitude, you end up in a ball of fire. So, cyclic back, collective down, manage your nose with your pedals, but then it's going to be start bringing that collective back in a little sooner than you would normally, and also you're going to want to bring that nose down, not completely, but from that 15 or 20 degrees that you might be pulling back to something more like 5, so that you can finish your transition like normal once you're slower. So let's put it in slow-mo, take it off pause, bring it up quite a lot, bring the collective down quite a lot, holding that 20 degrees, keeping an eye on our VVI here and there. And now I'm going to start bringing my collective back in, and there's that transition. And if I've done this well, I'm bringing my nose back down now. I'm gonna crash. I'm going into VRS, and I've lost my generator. Boom. So again, now that we're crossing the threshold here, alright, so we are about 130 kph, which is fine. We've got good rotor RPM, good engine RPM. We're going to pitch up a little more aggressively, try to slow ourselves down. The main difference is, again, we're only going to hold that aggressive pitch up for a couple of seconds, and then we've got to get that nose back down, and we've got to get that power back on. So pitch up, count a couple of seconds, start bringing your collective in slowly, 1 degree per second kind of deal, otherwise you're going to lose your generators. Do what I did, and bring your nose back down. Not all the way, but you're going to go from like 15 degrees down to 2.5 or whatever, or 15 to 5 or 20 to 5, something like that. Like I said, I don't actually watch my attitude indicator. I'm just looking at, am I slowing down enough? So take it off pause, pitch up aggressively. As we come down, now I'm bringing that collective back in, and I'm bringing the nose down. I'm going to lose it. Oh, there goes my generators, and I'm down again. So, overweight configuration, quick stops, bad. It is doable. Let's do it one more time. Alright, so as we cross this time at 150 kph, good engine RPM, so now we can pitch up and then come down again. And I didn't drop my collective for long. I bled off 50 kilometers per hour, and that was pretty much all I was comfortable doing, and then I'm going to transition normally. So the idea of taking a quick stop from 150 kph to 0 is probably not something you want to do, even in the best of scenarios. It's more of an emergency, oh crap, I need to slow down. The goal is to shed a whole bunch of speed quickly and then finish your transition normally from a slower speed. So you can use it if you come in too hot. If you come in at 250 kph and you need to bleed off speed, you can use it. You shouldn't, but you can. And then you can bleed it down to, say, 100 or just below 100, and then do a more normal speed transition to hover from there. Well, that's transition to hover. I know it was a long one, but there was a lot to cover. And like I said, this was the #1 thing that people say they still struggle with, so I wanted to make sure I did it justice. And I hope I've done that. So as with all my videos, and this one is no exception, if you know something that I missed or that I got wrong, please let me know below. I want to make sure people get the right information here and that I can actually help people with this. And if you're interested in trying this out for yourself, the map that I used for all of the demos will be linked below. It's on my Patreon page. You can find that in the description. So thank you everybody for watching and for being patient while I've been working on this for the last several months. And I'll catch you next time.